Hello.
It says, you're in the show. Everyone can see
Making
you.
some last minute tech adjustments here, but we're live. Good to see you, Olivia, and everybody else. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I just need to adjust my microphone and speaker. Do you still hear me all right, Olivia?
Mhm.
And you say something to make sure I still hear okay?
Hello, hello, hello.
Nope, I'm not. One moment.
Okay.
Try something now.
Hello, hello, hello.
Nope. All right. Can you start introducing what we're doing here while I try and fix this?
Sure. Hello. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour with Effective Artistry. My name is Olivia Candosia. That's Brandon Tessers. He's a licensed therapist. I am not. I'm an intern here at Effective Artistry. And this is a space where we can just talk about anything. We will just start talking, and whatever, you feel free to interrupt us whenever, because we will just go wherever you want to. And the more you comment, the more we know what you're interested in hearing us talk about. Can you hear me now, Brennan?
I do, yes. Sorry about
It's okay.
that.
I said who we are. I said what this is. And I said we'll just keep talking until people comment, and it'll give us a better idea of what they want to talk about. That's
Great.
how far I got.
Awesome. Yeah, we work with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family therapy with people in the state of Illinois. We also are in the process of launching some groups, one of which Olivia is involved with and co-facilitating, which we can maybe talk about that in a little bit. I know we did some of that last week, but we can do some more. And we've got a few others that will share some information as we keep going. We also work with a couple executive functioning coaches that can work with anyone in the world via the internet. Yeah, here we are. I'm a licensed therapist. Olivia's on her way to being a licensed therapist. But this is not therapy. It's just a conversation. And as usual, I was running late, obviously, and setting up tech stuff, so I haven't even said hello to you yet. Olivia, you're at home because you're not feeling well instead of in the office today. How are you doing?
I'm okay. It's just every time I swallow, it hurts, but that's what tea is for. So
tea is wonderful.
It is. I think it's going to be my new thing. You've inspired me.
Today, by the way, even though we've been going longer recently, this week is different, and we will only be going until the top of the hour, so 2:00 Central Time, just for anyone to know. I hate the angle with my bag right behind my head.
Get rid of it.
I'm going to do that real quick.
I didn't even know you had a hook there.
What's that?
I didn't know you had a hook there.
Yeah, that's funny, because I always keep my bag there and my coat.
I must never pay attention to that. It's funny.
Yeah, it's probably not a surprise, but maybe a surprise to know that I have tried like 17 different arrangements of furniture in this office to try and like set it up so that each thing that I need to do in here, the sitting area is arranged in a certain way relative to certain elements, windows and doors and whatever, and the computer and the video, and there's no perfect options. So what I had to settle for is allowing the hook to be right behind my head here.
Alas. Brandon, I just signed up to take the NCE in February.
Oh boy.
Which is very scary for me because I hate test taking.
The NCE is the National Counselor's Exam, for those who don't know, which is probably most people. It's in order to become a licensed therapist, at least in Illinois, the laws change state by state, but I think this stuff is every state. But in order to get licensed as a therapist, you have to get your master's degree, you have to complete an internship that meets specific criteria, and you have to pass this NCE test. It's kind of like passing the bar for a lawyer.
And I would love to know, Brandon, your perspective on like using apps that like to have practice questions every day versus reading a textbook. Like, not just for that, but just studying in general.
Cool. I like talking about studying. Well, I'll start with like some generic stuff, and then you can guide me with some specific questions and feedback, but rather than putting it on you right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Studying, as well as like, this is a big thing that comes up in executive functioning a lot, and where I like to start with people is saying that I need to study is kind of like saying I need to work. Like studying is a word that describes a category of actions, and it's really more about what those actions are aimed at than it is about specifically what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
People don't generally think of it that way. People generally think studying is like a defined set of actions. I need to like review my notes and do flashcards or whatever. But it isn't. And you should not study for different things in the same way. Because like anything else, the specifics of what you're dealing with is relevant.
Yeah.
And yes, that definitely includes some specifics about who you are and the context and the environment that you're in that might dictate what things are going to be most efficient for you. You know, what you have available to you dictates, at least in part, what things are going to be best strategies for you. But it also has a lot to do with what you're approaching. So for me, always the first step in developing studying, like a study plan, and I should be clear, developing a study plan is something that you do for each thing for which you are studying, not for a person. We don't come up with like, here's how you study best.
Right.
What we do is we develop a framework, the framework that I'm going to work on going through here with you about how to develop a study plan.
Mm-hmm.
And we teach a person how to go through that framework every time they have something to study for.
Okay.
And the first step, I like to call it reconnaissance because that feels fun to me.
Okay.
But the first step is to get as much information as possible about what you are studying for.
Uh-huh.
As much detailed and specific information as possible. And I won't ask you to like give specific details necessarily about the NCE right now, but I'll just ask generally, how much do you know about like the specific format, the question types, numbers of questions, content that will be covered, timing, etc.
All I know is I've got like 4 hours. And I've looked at like sample questions, but I don't know if that's true or not. So I don't know. Not much.
So here's how we do reconnaissance from a framework perspective. We got to get as much information as possible, but obviously it's helpful to have a structure of what order to go through. Generally speaking, when people are talking about studying, we are talking about, almost all the time, we're talking about some kind of a test or some kind of a performance where you have like one shot at something and it's being graded by another person. If that is not the case and you're calling it studying, then a lot of what we're about to talk about might not apply to what you're talking about. And so then I would encourage people to explore different language to like separate things out. What we're talking about is we're preparing for something that is graded, meaning there is some arbiter, some person or a group of people who will judge your performance and rank it as on some kind of a scale of better or worse or acceptable, unacceptable, whatever. So the very first step then is being clear on who it is that is going to be grading your performance and what is it that they are looking for. Not in specifics yet, starting out with like, what is the purpose of this thing that they are doing? In this case, the NCE is administered by the National Association of Counselors. I don't actually know what the acronym is, but National Counselors Association.
I don't know. I just have a link to Pearson Education, so that's, I don't know if they're in charge or what.
But ostensibly, what is it that they're attempting to do?
What are they attempting to do?
Yeah, what are they trying to find out?
To see if I have the knowledge, the skills to be a counselor. I don't even know. Yeah.
That's the function here, right? Yeah. Theoretically, we'll get more specific about the approach. But starting with, this is a national organization that is contracted with each state licensure department. And their job is to do their best to make sure that people who do not possess the knowledge necessary to be an effective counselor meeting certain standards do not get licensed. So they're just trying to determine. Now, it's a standardized test. This is almost always going to, no, not almost. This is always going to be true of a national test, is that it is standardized. When we're talking about taking a test like in your class Sometimes those are standardized. Generally, though, those are going to be things that like your teacher or professor developed that test, and it's not the same as a test that's administered elsewhere, which means it's not normed in the same way, and etc. Standardized tests like this one, like the SAT, ACT, GRE, MCAT, LSAT, like pretty much anything that's used for admissions to college or graduate school of any particular kind are standardized, which means they go through a whole process of being normed. They're in fact, part of what will happen on the NCE is that some of the questions that you are asked on the NCE won't actually be considered as part of the grade, because that's part of how they test for future questions, for future tests. They have to get a large sample size to be able to determine like this is a good question.
Sneaky.
The SAT, it's been several years since I used to tutor for the SAT, the ACT. I did tutor for the LSAT even once. Because there is, like, I didn't study law or pre-law, but I took a practice LSAT myself and aced it at the time, because there is so much about this that is about test taking more than it is about the content knowledge per se. That's why I'm starting with this, especially because we're talking about a standardized test, and then we'll talk about the content and whatever later. So on the SAT, there are 10 sections. One of those sections is not graded. Only 9 of them are actually graded. And you have 3 writing, 3 reading. Again, this might have switched since I last tutored the SAT, because it's been 8 years or so. But there were 3 writing, 3 reading, and 3 math. And then there would be a 4th of one of those 3 things. So you would know by the end of it which category was the fake one, because you know which one had 4 sections, but you wouldn't know which one it was. Generally speaking, these things are going to be multiple choice, because that's the by far most efficient way to be able to do a national standardized test. I believe the NCE is entirely multiple choice questions. Is that right? There's no short answer or essay.
Unfortunately.
Standardized tests are going to be multiple choice.
I feel like I can write my way out of anything, but like multiple choice stresses the heck out of me.
Yeah, so what we were talking about is that these people are ostensibly doing their best to verify that like there's a minimal standard of knowledge that has been deemed by them and the people with whom they work as being required for considering someone to be qualified to be a therapist, a counselor. I lost the second half of my sentence there. And what I was getting at is everybody understands that there are many, many elements of what it takes to be a counselor or a therapist that a standardized test has no ability to measure in any sense. That's why an internship is required. That's why there has to be a particular degree along with it. So they're focused in only on the things that a standardized test can measure. And because a standardized test is multiple choice, generally, that means that they have to be questions with definitive, clear, correct answers. There cannot be, well, it could be this. You can make an argument that it's a this thing. So generally what we're talking about is the memorization of facts. Either that or the application of known processes that allow you to uncover facts. So like math, for example, you're not going into a standardized math test having memorized all the facts but you do memorize the processes that allow you to take given information and end up with a certain set of facts. That is not the case for the NCE. It's not math. It's literally just memorizing facts.
I just hear you talk about this, and all I'm thinking is like, boo, don't want to do this, boo. Like, it just sounds so unappealing to me.
Yeah, it's very unappealing. I mean, I like it because I like standardized tests, but I'm a weirdo in that regard. I know that. Genuinely, this is just my belief. I do think that a lot of standardized tests, a huge part of what they're testing for is willingness and ability to take the test.
Hmm.
That like part of what they're saying here by implication is that in order to be an effective counselor, they believe that it is necessary that the person have the ability to identify a set of knowledge that is relevant, engage with that knowledge to the extent that they can retain it, and draw on it in a timed pressure scenario. Now, how much anybody actually really believes that, I don't know. But anyway, we're talking about studying. I don't want to get off too much on standardized tests specifically because we're talking about studying generally. But I want to make it clear that you're going to study for a standardized test differently than you're going to study for a test that your professor or teacher has developed. You're going to study for a test that involves multiple choice differently than you study for something that has short answer or essay questions, or that's an oral presentation or a performance. You're going to study for things differently based on the content of what you are studying. So we're just going through this as a specific example of figuring all that out. So the things you want to know is who is going to be grading the test? What is it that they are theoretically aiming at? Why are they going through this process? Why is it deemed to be a functional thing? And then the specific mechanisms they're going to be using in order to try and accomplish that. And that's where we get into things like all these logistics. When will the test be? How long is it? How many questions are on it? And what types of questions and what content is covered on the test? You should always be able to answer those questions. Anytime that you have to take a test, those answers should be available to you. Does that part make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So that would be my first suggestion for you specifically, Olivia, is go find the answers to all those questions.
Okay.
When is it? How long do you have? How many questions? What type of questions? And what content is supposed to be covered on the test?
Yeah.
Do you have those? You don't have to answer.
I mean, I have like a generic, but I couldn't give you like the real specific answer.
Yeah, that's a very common thing when people are getting ready to study. And part of what plays into the studying anxiety is why I started where I started. I think that is built a lot on this idea that there is a correct way to study. And so it doesn't really matter the specifics of this test. I just got to study. But without knowing the specifics, it's hard to be effective in studying. So people get stuck with, they're like, I don't know what to do, without recognizing that getting the specifics would help inform what to do next. They just treat it as a deficit. I'm bad at studying and I don't know how to study. Should I just do this? Should I just do that?
And I got this little app that like has like a sample test first to see like where your general line of knowledge is. And then it like breaks it down into like subdivisions. So like diagnostic stuff, and it'll quiz you on those. And then if you get it right, it's like, we won't show you this question in a while. And you just like answer those. And then the next one, it goes to like developmental theories or whatever. And same thing, which I don't know how I feel about. I don't know what I think of that.
I mean, that can be really cool, especially for a standardized test.
Yeah.
But I'm saying first, before engaging in that process, find the answers to these other questions.
Okay.
When is the test? When you're taking the test, what are the test conditions? Meaning, how long do you have? What resources do you have available to you or not?
It's February 11th. It's online. I cannot move out of my computer screen. And
that's different from when I took it. When I took it, I had to like go into a specific testing.
It's an option, but I didn't want to go in person because that would make me more scared. So now I'm just anxious about not getting out of frame to like make sure my computer is plugged in.
And again, you don't need to answer these questions for me, but I would write these things down.
Okay.
Make sure that you know when is it. That's a big important one because you need to be able to plan out in advance. What are the testing conditions, which includes like how long do I have? What environment is it in? What things do I have access to or not access to? What is it timed? Are there breaks available to me? And if so, how, et cetera? The logistics of what will it be like in reality when I am in the process of taking this test. Will there be a proctor announcing to you that you have 15 minutes left and 10 minutes left and stuff? Will there be other people around you? Obviously, you answered that in this particular case, but I'm just putting out, Are you going to be taking it with your class? Are you going to be taking it by yourself in a proctored location or blah, blah, blah. So testing conditions, testing format. What are the number of questions and the types of questions? How is it broken down? Is it in sections? And if so, how many sections and whatever?
That actually is very helpful.
And the content that is covered on the test. In this case, because it's a standardized test, you almost definitely, and from what I remember, but typically for standardized tests, you'll be able to get a percentages breakdown.
Mm-hmm.
And they won't give you specific information about actual questions that will be on the test,
Mm-hmm.
but you should be able to see like 20%, there will be 80 questions and 20% of them will cover diagnostics and 10% will cover research history and whatever.
We can pray. That's the truth.
If we're talking not a standardized test, but one that your professor or teacher has designed and is giving to you, then instead you should almost always have access to a study guide, and that's going to be your Bible that you base everything around.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, get all that information, record it down. Then we go on to the next step.
Mm-hmm.
The next step is doing some evaluation of how prepared you already are. Like, what do you already know and what do you not know? What things do you need to work on? And that falls into the content, like what content, knowledge, and abilities, skills, whatever do you have? That falls into the logistics. A hugely, hugely important part of test taking is what happens on the day, like beforehand and the night before and whatever. Again, back when I used to tutor SAT, ACT stuff, they said that this was studied. I don't know the details of how this research was done, but they said that on the ACT, the conditions of the test day, like things that happen outside of the actual test itself, vary a person's score by up to 5 points, which is huge on the ACT. How you eat breakfast and how you get to the location and how you sleep the night before. And this all, again, often seems silly to people, but this is a hugely important part of the preparation. And there are going to be times where, like, content knowledge, I have all that. But yeah, I don't know where the first time I took the SAT, it was at a location I'd never been before, and I got lost on my way there, and it was at a university, and like I could not find parking, and like I was stressed to hell and back, and then like running in, thinking I was gonna miss it, but just barely making it. It was terrible. I say the first time I took the SAT. That was the only time I took the SAT. But
I was so bad at tests, Brandon. I think I took the ACT twice, maybe 3 times. Each one maybe a point better, but it's just awful for me. And so this, like, having to do this again, maybe I'm a different woman now. Maybe I actually care about the content that is being presented to me. It just passed.
While I very much believe in magic, I think it is a poor strategy to rely on magic. That's kind of the point of what magic is. I believe in my version of magic. And saying maybe I'm a different woman now, that's magic thinking. That's maybe because there's things outside of my knowledge that might impact this stuff in some way it'll be different. And that is, yeah, that could be. But don't rely on it. Identify what things you can do something about.
Right.
The lie about tests, and especially standardized tests, the ones that we've been talking about the most today, the lie about tests is that they actually measure some intrinsic quality of the test taker. Mm-hmm. The SAT theoretically measures a person's scholastic aptitude. That is a construct. That's a made-up concept. Mm-hmm. Anyone who is honest about tests, and generally test designers are people who will be honest about tests, whether it's an IQ test or anything else. The only true honest answer for what does this test measure is whatever it is that it measures. It measures your ability to succeed at the ACT. It measures your ability to perform well on the NCE.
Right.
We're designing these things hoping, and then especially with standardized tests, doing follow-up research to test validity. Do these things actually correlate? Does passing the NCE actually correlate with, being accomplished as a therapist and whatever? I don't know the specifics of what's been done on these follow-ups for this. I just assume that it has been, because without getting into it today, because it's really not worth it. Standardized test taking is a massive industry, and the companies that design and run these tests, they bid and they sell their product and whatever. So they do a lot of research to be able to provide evidence that their product is a worthwhile thing. So I assume that research has been done. Because otherwise, no state's going to be like, yeah, we'll pay millions and millions of dollars to, and integrate your private company product. They're almost always nonprofit companies, but they're still private companies or private organizations. Will incorporate your product into like the legality of how our system works, whatever they want evidence. Anyway, these things do not measure anything that's intrinsic about the person. That's part of the point of your ACT score can vary from the conditions of the day by up to 5 points. Obviously, like if a person can retake the same test and get a different score, which is generally what's going to happen. It's pretty rare for a person to take the same test 2 different times and get the exact same score. It happens, but it's rare. Then obviously there are variables here beyond just like, what do you know, or if I took a test that measured how tall I am one day to the next, there's going to be very, very minor variation in the results. If I took a test that theoretically measures how happy I am, the results are going to vary a lot one day to the next, right? Because one of those things measures an inherent characteristic, a relatively unchanging thing about me. And one of those tests measures something that is ephemeral and difficult even to define. These things do not measure your intelligence. They don't measure your aptitude. They don't measure your knowledge base, because even if the questions and the format of the test was designed to perfectly encapsulate that, something that is baked in is you have to take the test. You could know the answer to every one of these questions, but in a timed and pressure scenario, you get anxious and panic and can't access any of that information. That's what you're worried about, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Which is part of why I'm saying, after we've identified what is it that we're preparing for, there's different categories. One is content knowledge. One is the logistics and the conditions of the day. How do I make sure that at the time of taking the test, I'm in the condition that is best for me to be able to do well on the test? Mm-hmm. And one is about like being able to navigate the format of the test. So not just the content, but the ability to utilize the content within, I can know everything there is to know about biology, but if it's an essay test, I still need to also know how to be able to write an essay.
Right. No, that's helpful, because I feel like everyone's just like, read this purple book. That will help you. But what you're saying is so much more useful for me, like to ease that anxiety of, okay, what are we actually looking for? Yeah. And when I hear use the purple book or use the app, I'm like, well, it's worked for other people, fully well knowing that it might not work for me.
Generally, those kinds of sources, again, those are things that are only going to exist for standardized tests. Mm-hmm. And those sources are really great for part of the reconnaissance in that it will go over in detail how is the test administered, when do you get breaks, what are the sections, what are the percentage of questions that relate to this category, and what does we define that category as, and here's a bunch of stuff that would fall under that category and example questions that would look like that, and so on. So it's really great for that. And it's really great for content knowledge. Specifically, we'll talk in a second about taking a practice test, which is what you did. That helps you identify like where you want to focus content knowledge. These resources, it depends on a lot of things. They vary in how effective they are in actually imparting content knowledge. Like once you identify a content area weakness, or somewhere that you don't know enough about stuff, or depends on the kind of person and the kind of test and the kind of content, how beneficial books and apps can be in like teaching you that stuff. And really great for helping you to handle that third category. So we're saying content knowledge, the logistics and the conditions of the day, and the format. Not content, format of the test itself, and format of the test taking experience.
Sure.
And they're really great for the format of the test itself, practice.
Mm-hmm.
Not generally so great for learning the content.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Can you look?
I'm confused. That sentence didn't make sense to me.
In other words, apps and books and things can be really helpful if you're trying to learn, like, what is the format of an essay that I should write for this test?
Got it. Versus the actual.
Just like practice, applying content knowledge about a fairly what's the word I'm looking for? Counseling is everything that can be measured on a test like this that is relevant to counseling falls under what we call the soft sciences or the social sciences, where it's not as easy to define. No, that's not the word I'm looking for. Whatever. It's stuff that is not designed to be put on a multiple choice answer of one's correct and many are incorrect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so practicing tapping into content knowledge that you have in a way like reading the question, accessing content knowledge, and then using that to select an answer, that process is something that you can practice and get better at and better at. And so that's what I'm saying that these things are really good at. They're generally not the best at giving you content knowledge, but
Yes.
practicing your ability to utilize content knowledge in a way that is effective on the test.
Yes. And that's what I was noticing. I'm like, this is great, but some of this content I don't know. And I would like to have something to give me that content before taking those tests. Yeah.
So step one was reconnaissance. This step two here, I call it different things, but right now we're going to call it self-scouting, which is you're doing your evaluation of where you are most would benefit most from doing some additional work, right? And you're just evaluating in those three categories. Like I, as opposed to your experience, I mean, this has probably been implied, but I'll just be explicit that I am really, really good at taking tests. That's part of why I was able to be a test taking tutor, is because one of the criteria is just you have to score a certain amount. I'm really good at the format of tests. So especially standardized tests. So I got really great results, even if I didn't have like a wealth of content knowledge per se. The big problem, maybe we should have just made this entirely about standardized tests because we're talking about it so much, but the big problem, especially with standardized tests, is that there is an inevitable gap between what they're attempting to measure and what they're actually measuring. So this causes a problem where everybody thinks that what you need in order to do well on these tests is content knowledge, because that's what's said about these things, is they're measuring, do you know this stuff? And so then everybody just focuses on content knowledge and ignores all the other parts of it.
Yeah.
But that's not really the biggest part of what they're measuring. Content knowledge. They're measuring your ability to perform the specific tasks that the test is asking you to perform. So like the ability to access and utilize content knowledge is different from having content knowledge.
Yes, it is.
And the ability to access and utilize it in a particular setting and through a particular format is different from just the general ability to access and utilize.
I would like an alternate exam where I just like give a speech and people can ask me questions.
There's a reason that they don't let you do that. Specifically here, because there's an entire skill set that people can label it in different ways, but one way of talking about it is BSing.
Yeah.
Where you can sound to any observer like you know what you're talking about, even when you don't.
Yep.
And that's why there's like an internship component and a whatever component as well. Even though this is a field that does not have anything to do with sitting down and applying specific content knowledge of a factual nature in a written, has nothing to do with anything. But they're adding that component. The component that is testing your ability to like stand up in front of people and answer questions, whether you know the answer or not, that's handled in the internship and that's handled in the classes. this is a different thing. And it's not great, but it's better than the whole point of licensure in any professional regulation, career. That's not the word I'm looking for, but what's that? Industry.
Yeah.
Industry. In any like professionally regulated industry, professionals, people who have to get licenses from state and federal and local governments in order to be able to practice a certain thing. The reason that those things are regulated in that way is because whatever it is that whatever the services are that you're providing are things that the people who are coming to you for those services are in very vulnerable states when you're doing that. If you go to somebody to be your lawyer and they don't know what they're doing, that's a big problem for you. And because it's such an expertise-oriented, very niche thing, each individual person's ability to assess whether my lawyer knows what he's doing or not is not great. So we have this workaround, a way for the state to say, like, look, just you can trust that if they've gone through our process and are licensed, you can trust that they have passed a minimal standard of qualifications. They're still going to vary in how like knowledgeable and successful and effective they are, but there's a minimum. And it's not, as much as we don't like these things, and because this is one part of what we could talk about as gatekeeping that makes this and other professional industries difficult for people to enter into. As much as we can talk about the downsides of that, and there really are flaws and limitations and downsides, the alternative of just saying, well, everybody do whatever you want is also not great and also has flaws and downsides and limitations. Do I think we've found the perfect balance? Not by a long shot. I think there's a lot of flaws that could be improved upon in practical ways. But yeah, I mean, theoretically, this is part of the government's effort to protect people from bad actors, which is, I believe, an important role of government. You know, like the whole point of government is we collectively are agreeing to to funnel some of our individual resources and even choices, you know, like what we're allowed to do and not allowed to do. We're all agreeing to contribute some of that to a communal thing that theoretically is doing its best to focus on what is best for the community at large, as opposed to any specific human individual. Again, flaws, but I believe in regulation, government regulation. It's annoying, for sure, and it's flawed, but it's better than just letting people do whatever they want in this case. Do I think that we need a standardized test for counselors? No, not really, but they have to come up with something, I guess, and this is what they came up with. I wish it weren't the case either, but it is. Anyway, so you do that self-scouting. And self-scouting in terms of both the content knowledge and the ability to utilize that content in the format of the test, the way the test is asking you to do things, not the conditions in which you do the test. Best way to do that is to do some kind of preliminary. So in a standardized test, you take a practice test. Those are widely available. For non-standardized tests, again, like I said before, you should have access to a study guide of some kind. Not all professors and teachers do that, but there should theoretically be, especially as time goes on, this is a pretty nothing's unanimous, but there's a pretty clear and large consensus that in order to try and actually do the best we can to measure what we're trying to measure, we should do everything we can to eliminate how other things might bleed into and impact the performance, which means we should give as much information as possible in advance about what it is we're going to be doing so that we can test the actual thing we're trying to test rather than just like, do people know how to write an essay about that stuff? So generally, you'll have some version of a study guide or some advanced information about what are we studying? Well, it's a test on chapter 6, or What is there are going to be multiple choice questions and some true and false and a few short answers, or this will be an essay test or whatever. Get that information. The best study guides, and these are fairly widespread, especially in high school these days, are ones that are almost exactly like what the test will be. A lot of the time, the study guide, in high school especially, will literally be in a copy of the test that you're going to take.
Yeah.
So you need a study guide. With a standardized test, best way to do that is to take a practice test first and then start approaching through a study guide so that you can identify where it's worth spending your resources more. Does that part make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Now, I think the question you were asking originally, as is usually the case when people ask about studying, is the next part, which is develop your tactics, the things that you are going to do in order to improve the areas where you're wanting to improve. So part of how we do that in the self-scouting is by looking at return on investment.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, SAT as an example, there's vocabulary questions. Again, I'll give the caveat that maybe things have changed since I stopped paying attention to the SAT, but there's vocabulary questions. One very common approach to studying for the SAT is to learn and memorize as many SAT-style vocabulary terms as possible. That's a really, really low return on investment strategy. That will only
very broad.
What's that?
It was very broad.
Yeah, well, it's very specific and actionable, so it feels like you're doing something.
Mm-hmm.
But that will only benefit you if one of the terms that you studied that you didn't know but do remember after studying it is one of the terms that shows up on the test. Mm-hmm. And that will happen. So, or at least there's a good chance of that happening. It's reasonable to believe that will happen. So people will engage in this and when you say that's not how they should be spending their resources, they'll think like, but this will help me, whatever. It's true. Really low return on investment. And this is where we come back to accomplishment equation stuff like we talk about all the time. You have finite resources. You can only do so much. We need to identify the highest return on investment strategies. Because of course, if you learned every word in the English language and learned the entirety of trigonometry backwards and forwards and whatever, then and also practiced all the format stuff and the test condition stuff, then yeah, you'll get 100%. But you can't do all that.
Mm-hmm. So what can I do? What can we do?
So you started by taking your practice test, and that should give you some information. When you do the reconnaissance, that'll also give you information as you become more aware of like the testing conditions. Like, oh, I can't take a bathroom break is going to dictate some of what you need to prepare for in order to be able to take the test. Also with testing conditions, one of my best pieces of advice, do not change things on the day of the test. Don't eat a different breakfast than you normally eat. Don't sleep at a different time than you normally sleep. So if you determine that eating a certain kind of a breakfast or sleeping a certain kind of a way would benefit you on that test, you got to start implementing those changes weeks in advance. Because even though it makes so much sense, normally I don't eat breakfast, but for something like this, I want to make sure to get some stuff in my system. Because you haven't done it before, you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know how that's going to impact your GI system and that you'll need to use the bathroom in a different way than you usually do. And you're caught up, So anyway, you'll identify through reconnaissance and through the self-scouting what areas you want to focus on. Your question, as most people when they asked this, was focused around the content knowledge. How do I get the content knowledge? And that's going to depend. But if you have other people available to you, every single one of the most effective strategies will involve other people studying with you, assisting you in your studying. Whether they're also studying for the same thing or not doesn't matter. It's just whether they will engage in the things that are helpful to you to study. Studying by yourself is the absolute worst, least efficient way to study. Don't do it ever. There's a middle ground between I have somebody else that can help me study and I'm all by myself, which is utilizing sources. In particular, these days, there are videos and articles for everything. Do not try to teach yourself this stuff. there's, a saying about in order to be able to teach something effectively, you have to have mastered it. You can't teach yourself something. That is not how teaching works.
Mm-hmm.
You can memorize information. That's a very low efficiency strategy, and it is something that has, the further in advance you begin, the less value it has. Trying to memorize stuff a year in advance of a test won't benefit you. There's a reason that if that's what you're focused on, as people often are, I got to learn this information, drill these flashcards, whatever. If that's what you're focused on, there's a reason you're not studying well in advance, because that is a short-term memory strategy, not a long-term memory. And there's no point to doing it. You're just wasting your time and energy if you're doing it months in advance. That's something you do like in the week leading up to a test.
Mm-hmm.
Really most effectively, literally in the hour or two before a test, especially if we're talking about not standardized tests. So get other people involved, and we'll talk about some specific strategies you can use there. If you can't get literal other people involved, look into resources for videos. And this is, again, where apps and websites can come in handy, because they can give you kind of like coursework stuff, video stuff to help address these things. Practice tests, books with practice tests in them have a version of this that's I would say generally the least efficient version of this, which is you take a test, you answer the question, and then when you go and grade it later, it gives the correct answer and the explanation for the correct answer. So that's still learning from somebody else. It's just less effective generally than videos, and certainly less effective than people. Ask me your next question.
My next question, I don't have a question. I just I'm feeling guilty for taking up so much time with this.
Why? This is great.
Okay, good. Second question.
Good to have like a specific thing to discuss.
Yeah.
I didn't give you any specific strategies yet. I just talked about like some stuff we can talk about.
Yeah, I think I'm thinking about like timeline. Like a lot of people have been saying like you should start studying 3 months in advance for the NCE. And I don't know what that means. And now I'm like, oh man, I only have this amount of months. Like I only have 2.5, or like I only have 2. Am I going to be okay? Well,
that's part of why we do the reconnaissance and the self-scouting. Yeah. First is to figure out what resources do you have available.
Yeah.
Am I going to be okay? It has nothing to do with what people's recommendations are, and people's recommendations. I mean, even if we're going to say like that's, the optimal time, like what is that based on, and what do you do in that time? Like,
right. I'm like, is that every day? Do I include weekends?
It's the same as saying like you should sleep 8 hours a night or whatever. Like it's not unhelpful advice. It is information that comes from like a statistical view of what benefits most people.
Right.
It's not directly relevant to you, but if you're looking for something and you have no guidance, it's good to start with like what's most common.
Yeah.
But don't treat it as if you do the thing that's most common, you'll be good, and if you don't, you'll be bad. It's just this is the place to start, because this is what most people's experience.
Usually I end up doing what's not common, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Generally for standardized tests. So the earlier you start preparing for something, and when we're talking about like 3 months or whatever in advance, we're almost always talking about standardized tests.
Mm-hmm.
Usually the other kinds of tests, you get a couple weeks notice at most or whatever. You might get like a syllabus at the beginning of the semester that says when the final is, but you don't generally get a lot of information about what the final is until you get closer to it. The earlier you start, the better it is to focus on under the content label, strategies that impact long-term memory, not short-term or working memory.
So what are those
Short-term or
strategies?
working memory is a waste. Long-term memory is about actual utilization.
Okay.
So under the category of having other people in order to be able to help you, you have other people ask you questions.
Okay.
And yes, there's a version of that looks like a flashcard where like somebody else is holding it up and you're saying, that's not what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
What I'm talking about is if you have information in long-term memory, you can answer a person's questions regarding that information in non-rote ways.
Mm.
Right? Like if I have a definition memory, if someone's like, what's executive functioning? I say, well, it's the hypothetical set of cognitive processes that allow a person to control their own behavior. And then they're like, well, what does that mean? I'm like, I don't know. It's the hypothetical, like that's rote memorization. That is temporary. It does not last long.
Yep. That's, oh my God. That's why when I would study when I was little, I would say it and then I'd talk to my pretend camera about what that actually means.
Yeah. In the tech world, there's something called rubber ducky deprogramming, where you have a little rubber duck. Sometimes people literally do it with a rubber duck, but it can be other things. You have a rubber duck on top of your computer, and when you get stuck on a problem, you explain the problem to the rubber duck.
That's great.
There's a reason these things work. In order to be able to communicate the ideas to somebody else, you have to organize and access and utilize that information differently than in just giving rote explanations.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a practice question that I still remember from the NCE had to do with the light bulb effect in industrial psychology, a specific phenomenon. And like, you can memorize so-and-so, and I don't remember, such and such psychologist did this study in this year, and the results was this thing. Obviously, I don't remember that, even though I probably did when I first learned it, because that kind of information is not relevant to actually using it, so it's hard to get it to stick. But if somebody were to ask me what is the light bulb effect, I can explain it. And it's relevant. The light bulb effect is talking about, there was an initial study done where they had a theory, a hypothesis that different lighting conditions would impact employee productivity in industrial environments. And so they tried to do better lighting and saw, they got a baseline, then they did better lighting and saw, improved productivity. But then they did worse lighting and they saw also improved productivity. And what ended up coming out of this is the realization that people work harder when they're being watched. That like, if you change a variable and then watch people to see if they work harder, they're working harder because you're watching them.
Yeah.
And understanding it in that way, was that?
I'm never going to forget this.
Yeah, understanding it in that way is relevant. That means something. It means something to me and to other people, because people will say all the time, well, studies showed that blah, blah, blah. Well, did you know? Like, here's one of these elements that might impact that or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So having people who are like asking you questions, even if they don't have any interest in the content area themselves, you can hand them the book or whatever and say, and they'll say like, hey, what's this thing? And when you don't know it, then you're like, hand me that book, let me look at it and try and like learn it right now and be able to put it, relay it to you in words that are my own words. Like, oh, I know what this is. I didn't know that specific phrase, but it's this. Cool. Or like, looks like what this is such and such thing, whatever. Mm-hmm. So translating. The earlier you start, the more it is about translating, taking in information, translating it into language that means something to you, or even better, means something to a person to whom you are talking. The closer you get to the test, the better it is to focus on brute rote memorization techniques, including things like flashcards. Part of why we're doing the reconnaissance, I got to get wrapping up here in a minute, so I'm going to go really fast here. Part of why we're doing the reconnaissance to figure out like content area breakdowns. As an example, in the ACT math, again, it might have changed since I did the tutoring. There were 60 questions. You had 60 minutes to do it. The way that all the content broke down was blah, 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 blah. 4 of the 60 questions come from the realm of trigonometry. Of those 4 questions, 3 of them are just SOHCAHTOA questions. If you know sine equals the opposite over the hypotenuse, if you know SOHCAHTOA, you can do those 3. The 4th one can be anything else from trigonometry. Terrible strategy for people to study trigonometry in preparing for the ACT. Even if you manage to be able to answer that one question that you wouldn't have been able to had you not done all that trigonometry study, it is just a very low return on your effort. So when there's something that's like 35% of the questions fall under this category, that dictates how much time you want to spend on that. 10% fall under this. And you can also then break those content areas down and say, so again, I'm remembering here, and so maybe remembering inaccurately, but I believe that like research questions, meaning like questions about famous research studies and their results, I think that was like 10%, maybe 15%, the relatively low percentage. That category is also one that requires rote memorization for the most part, to be able to say who did what study at what time or whatever. So that's a thing that I would not study early on. Wait until like the last couple weeks before the test, and then just do a deep dive on like drilling that stuff in. And yes, using mnemonic devices, which we can talk more about some other time and whatever, to increase retention. But the earlier you're starting, the more you're focused on actually learning, meaning in the way that you internalize that information in long-term memory, which requires that you be able to understand how it is relevant to real world situations. And if you don't have an actual real world situation where it's relevant, the best substitute for that is another person asking you about it, because that's now a real world thing, is sharing this information with that person. The closer you get to the test, that's when you're going to focus in on short-term memory stuff, including like the day of and the day before, whatever.
That was helpful. That was good. That was a good crash course. I'm going to send this stream to all my classmates.
Yeah, and we can talk about more stuff, because also earlier on is a better time to focus in on like doing the prep work that helps with the test conditions, meaning addressing the kinds of things that lead to test anxiety on test day.
Yeah.
That's stuff that you can start working on in advance, and the earlier you start working on it, the better. Yeah. The only other thing that I recommend for people, well, there's lots of specific things, but the only like general thing that I recommend for people real early on is when you get that purple book, for example, like this is what I did with that. You get the audiobook version and just put it on in your car, so when you're driving around, you hear it. Like,
that's a great idea, Brandon.
Yeah, latent learning, stuff that's just in the background where you're not focused in on like, I gotta study and learn this thing, but just have it be in your environment, including environmental print, putting stuff up on your wall, just stuff that you see and hear, and like it kind of seeps in. Very low effectiveness, but also very low cost. So relatively efficient, because all you got to do is just like put the stuff up, put it in the car, whatever. And yeah, you're not going to get a ton out of it, but it also doesn't cost you a lot to do it. And you never know what might stick.
Great. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, we'll talk more specific some other time. I like having specific things like this.
Good. I'm glad. I'm so glad.
Yeah. All right. It's good to be with you, Olivia, and with you all watching this. We'll be back next week. Happy Thanksgiving this week to those of you who celebrate.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Be well.